Some of the images in this slideshow are of folks who, as we'll talk about in the slides, were displayed in freak shows against their consent, as far as the evidence shows. No images of violence in the against people's bodies, but I just want you to know in advance that there are, this is something I'm very attentive to as a scholar of folks in the past who didn't necessarily consent to their display. So I try to be very mindful about the images I show you. There are some images in this slide deck that are of folks, as I said, who were likely displayed without their consent. With that, I will start, and again, my goal is to finish by 5:45 so that we'll have plenty of time for questions. So on April 7th, 1891, about 129 years ago, the most famous man in the United States died in Connecticut. And that man was not a president or a war hero or a business giant. It was P.T. Barnum. This guy right here, the most successful American showman, and the man that some scholars have called the first American celebrity. Today, Barnum is best known to us as the namesake of the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus. You may have eaten his animal cracker, well, not his animal crackers, but the circus's animal crackers as a kid. The circus itself shut down just 3 years ago in 2017 after being in business since the 1870s. So you're getting used to my controls here. There we go. But Barnum is also perhaps familiar to us today because he is he was played in a fictionalized form by Hugh Jackman in a hugely popular Hollywood film, The Greatest Showman, that also coincidentally came out in 2017. If you have questions about The Greatest Showman and why it is extraordinarily historically inaccurate, I would be more than happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But during his lifetime, Barnum was not known for his circus, a business that he only entered in the final years of his life. Instead, Barnum was known for displaying odd and unusual objects to the American public in his museum in New York City and on stages across the world. Barnum was certainly not the first person to peddle such oddities, but he was undoubtedly the best at this job. He was the most innovative, the most successful, and the man who had overall the greatest impact on American popular culture during the 19th century. And when I say 19th century, I mean 1800, so between 1800 and 1899. Barnum's business was one of the most pervasive forms of popular entertainment in the United States from about the 1840s through the 1920s. And that is the commercial exhibition of a group of unusual human bodies on a stage in front of a large audience, also known as a freak show. Freak shows were enormously popular during that nearly 100-year period, about the 1840s through the 1920s. Freak shows could be found in cities and towns from San Francisco to New York City, and audience members included men, women, and children from the working class all the way up to the wealthy elites. In fact, in Europe, even the Queen of England attended freak show performances. Yet despite this range in audience demographics, audience members, as well as the showmen and the managers who put on these shows, they were all overwhelmingly white. And as we will talk about later today, this whiteness profoundly shaped both who and what appeared on stage and what these performances meant to the audience members who saw it. This period during which freak shows felt nearly ubiquitous in American popular entertainment was also a time when larger changes to work and residence patterns meant that more and more white Americans had both the disposable income and the leisure time outside of work hours, to patronize a freak show after their work was finished or on the weekends. Or if they couldn't see one in person, to read a newspaper or magazine article about a freak show, or even to buy a photographic portrait of a favorite performer, or keep a book of portraits similar to a photographic album in their homes. What this means then is that freak shows were not just enormously popular, they were also enormously significant and influential in shaping the way that ordinary white Americans understood the world around them. And moreover, their relationship to other people and other cultures who lived in that world. In short, what I hope to show you today in this talk is that freak shows weren't just some seedy form of mindless entertainment, as we might assume. Instead, 19th century freak shows can provide us with a window onto the ideals, the values, and the prejudices that 19th and early 20th century Americans, especially white Americans, held. Freak shows were in many ways like a public classroom where people could learn about race, about gender, about disability, about imperialism, about national identity, and about power. I want to start off by talking through some basics of what a freak show was, what it means, what it looked like, who was on the stage, and who was in the audience. The basic definition of a freak show is an exhibition of a group of human beings who were unusual in some way that was visible to the eye. Visible as opposed to textual or oral to the ear, so something visual to the eye. And when I say the word unusual, I want to be very clear that I mean that not in some kind of absolute or definitional way, but unusual relative to the viewer's own experience and their own context. As we'll see in a few minutes, some of the people who appeared on 19th century freak show stages seem hardly unusual at all to our 21st century eyes. And that's why I really want to stress that all of this is contextual and historically specific. The concept behind the freak show was not new to the 1840s. In fact, the display of unusual human bodies has a long history, both in Europe and the land that would become the United States. There is evidence in Europe as early as the 16th century of individual people with unusual bodies being exhibited as a traveling attraction, showing in taverns or on street corners or in a lecture hall rented for the occasion. These kinds of individual traveling shows could be seen in colonial North America starting in the 18th century. But in the 1840s, this display of unusual human bodies was formally organized and institutionalized into exhibitions like the one I showed you before, and I'm showing here again. Large groups of performers of all different types that would be exhibited together in a hall or in a pavilion in a building of some kind, and a building that audience members would have paid a flat fee to enter. And once they entered, they could view all of the performers on stage. I want to draw your attention to a couple of features of this particular image. While first noting that it's a promotional image, not a photograph, not a capturing of real life. So we should take some of its features with a grain of salt. Perhaps the sheer volume of people in the audience might be a bit of an embellishment. But two features I want to draw your attention to about the audience, we're talking about the audience for the moment, is the class variance we can see as well as the gender variance we can see. So for class, and I saw on the list of audience members, I have some former students here. Hello. You might remember we've talked about this before in my classes. We're always looking at hats when we look at historical images, because the hats here in the bottom, and hopefully you can see my mouse here, will show us a range of class markers. So we have some folks wearing this kind of top hat, black top hat style that indicates someone of wealth. And then we also see this more rounded bowler style hat, this lighter colored hat. We even see a kind of straw hat right here. And what this is intended to signal to the viewer in a 19th century context is that people from the working class through the elite were welcomed at a freak show. I also wanted to just point out that we also see men and women alike in this image. We see these two people, this person here and this person here, this person here, this person here, for example, are all dressed in contemporary normative female clothing. So what this signals to us basically is that freak shows were a mixed class environment. And moreover, that unlike the way that freak shows are perceived today, in their heyday, performances like this were viewed as wholesome, family-friendly, socially sanctioned entertainment, the kind that women were welcome at, the kind that children would be brought to as well. One of the ways that freak shows became so ubiquitous in American popular entertainment is because they could be set up on a wide range of spaces and venues. The image we see here is just one example of what a freak show might have looked like. First, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of predecessors to a freak show, these individual traveling exhibits, were displayed typically in a temporary space, such as a tavern, a public garden, a rented hall. But starting in the 1840s, freak shows in that consolidated form like we see here began to occupy more permanent spaces and spaces that were designed specifically for freak show display. So one example is a museum. Freak show performers after the 1840s could frequently be found in museums, especially in dime museums, which were, as the name suggests, inexpensive museums located in American cities where the admission was just 10 cents. Every city of a decent size had its own dime museum, or one or more. New York City, for example, had dozens of dime museums by the 1890s. And I just want to show you an advertisement for one example. This is a newspaper ad from 1886 of a dime museum in Grand Rapids, Michigan. This is a full-page ad on the second page of the local Telegram Herald, July 4th edition, in fact. And we see here a description of some of the things that could be found at this particular dime museum. I want to draw your attention to one particular performer here, Miss Annie Jones, the bearded princess. We're going to be looking at a few images of bearded ladies a little bit later. Annie Jones is one example of a bearded lady performer. So we see here a dime museum as one site of freak show performance. The main dime museums, as you can see, had a wide array of things on display and people on display, but the main attraction of a dime museum in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were the freak show performers. And popular performers might actually travel from museum to museum, drawing large crowds wherever they went. For example, there was one very successful performer known as Jojo the Dog-Faced Boy. This was a young man who had a lot of hair on his face. He was so popular that the manager of a dime museum booked him for 23 shows per day because the demand from visitors was so high. Some freak show performers went on the road even more broadly than the one I've just described, traveling with circuses as a circus sideshow. And here's an example of, actually kind of late example of a circus sideshow from 1935, a photograph of the Hagenbeck Wallace Circus, which was at some point the second most popular circus in the United States after the Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey. That, as you see in this photograph, this is the big top, right? This is the main tent of the circus. And then here on the left is the sideshow. The sideshow was the site where a freak show performance would be held, and it was typically housed in a smaller tent to the side of the main big tent. By the 1870s, the majority of American circuses had a freak show inside as their sideshow, and these sideshows soon became the main venue in which audience members could see a freak show performance. So when it came to the people that could be seen on these stages, the range of performers was as varied as the venues in which they appeared. Freak show performers included everyone from statistically unusual bodies, that is to say, babies born with the kind of 1 in a million body configuration or bodily shape, everyone from these kinds of truly statistically anomalous bodies to performers with impressive skills to absolutely ordinary bodies from a culture or a part of the world that was unfamiliar to the freak show's largely white audience. And one way we can think about this wide range of performers that could be seen on a freak show stage is to use a classification system that one of the first major freak show scholars created in the late 1980s. This is a sociologist named Robert Bogdan, and he's one of the earliest scholars to take freak shows seriously as a subject of scholarly inquiry. One of his contributions to this field of study was to create two categories of 19th century freak show performers in the United States. And these two categories Bogdan called the born freak and the made freak. Now, right away, I want to flag an issue for you with these terms. Although as a scholar of freak shows, I've found Bogdan's work to be enormously useful. This book, Freak Show, from which these terms come, I often refer to it as like a Bible for freak show studies because it's so significant. I refer to it constantly. But nevertheless, the word born that Bogdan uses suggests that there is something self-evident, something obvious, something natural about these particular performers, and that other performers are perhaps false or crafted. But in fact, there is two issues at play here. One is that there's nothing actually obvious at all about who landed on a freak show stage. Moreover, all freak show performers were crafted, as we'll explore in detail in a few more minutes. So I wanted from the beginning get us sort of questioning the utility of these two terms. They do have some utility, but I want to just flag these assumptions we might make based on the terms. To return to these categories for a moment, the first category that Bogdan outlined, the born freak, referred to people whose bodies were born in a statistically anomalous kind of way. These are the kind of 1 in a million bodies I talked about earlier. I have a few examples here on the slide. This might include people who are very short, like a man who performed as General Tom Thumb. He's on the left here with P.T. Barnum. It could include very, very tall people, like the woman in the middle named Anna Swan, who performed as a giant. It could also include people who were missing an arm or leg or both, people who had hair all over their bodies, or people whose limbs were of unusual size. And that's the third example you see here, this man with very short arms who performed as CeeLo. This category also included people who we would now recognize as suffering from developmental disorders. This category, for example, includes people who would be exhibited with the phrase pinhead. Pinhead refers to people who we would today recognize as likely suffering from the condition called microencephaly, in which the brain is unusually small due to a small head circumference. And if that phrase that word microencephaly rings a bell in your mind, this is the birth defect that was occurring in pregnant women who had the Zika virus. So this is a more recent example when microencephaly became sort of part of public consciousness. But there were many people who we would likely today identify as having microencephaly who would perform under this word pinhead. When someone in this category of born freak performed in a freak show, they might just stand on the stage to be looked at, or they might perform talents or skills that impressed the audience. For example, so I guess what I mean to suggest here is there is in some performances a passivity and in some a more active performance. For example, I'm showing you here conjoined twin sisters, Millie Christine McCoy, who would sing, they would dance, they would converse with audiences in foreign languages. The sisters were said to speak between them, I think, over a dozen languages. So sometimes one would speak in one language to an audience member and the other would speak in a different language to a different audience member. And the fact that they sang as well is why they were sometimes pitched as the two-headed nightingale, as you see in this promotional image on the right. So born freaks is the first category that Bogdan outlines. The second category he calls made freaks. And these were people who had either deliberately altered their bodies or learned a skill that put them on the freak show stage. And this category includes the tattooed ladies that were sort of the occasion for this talk. This category also included people who could swallow swords, people who could charm snakes, or even people who grew their hair very long. The image I'm showing you in the middle here are the 7 Sutherland sisters. Their claim to fame was that they all had really long hair. Now, there is a third category of performers that Bogdan does not give a name in his book, but I usually like to refer to this category, or I've come to refer to this category in my research as cultural freaks. Now, cultural freak, as I use it here, refers to people who did not necessarily have an unusual body like the born freaks, or had not learned a special skill or altered their body in any kind of way like the made freaks. The attraction of folks who fell into this category simply lay in the fact that they belonged to a culture or to a racial group or to a nation that was unfamiliar to the largely white audience. Here's one example that I'm showing you here. In 1850, P.T. Barnum debuted an exhibit that he called The Living Chinese Family, which consisted of a teenage Chinese woman named Huan Yiku, who is described as a Chinese belle, B-E-L-L-E with an E at the end, as well as a group of attendants who posed with her, including a servant, a music professor, and an interpreter. Visitors who came to see the living Chinese family watched as Puan Yiku spoke in Chinese, played Chinese musical instruments, and used chopsticks. She did have one bodily feature that also attracted audiences, and that was her bound feet, which Barnum claimed were only 2.5 inches long, but were likely quite a bit longer. The living Chinese family is just one of many examples of people from other parts of the world than the United States who were displayed as freakish simply by virtue of being unfamiliar to their American audience. What I want you to take away from this typology I've just outlined is not simply the wide array of people that could be seen by a paying audience member who attended a freak show. It's also the fact that the kinds of people considered worthy of a freak show stage in the 19th century were not obvious nor intuitive. For example, I'm sure that few of us today would argue that a woman with a tattooed chest piece makes sense to be performing in a freak show alongside someone who's a true statistical anomaly, for example, a pair of conjoined twins. And what this demonstrates to us is just how historically specific these freak show characters really were. In other words, what counted as freakish during this time period can tell us something about 19th century cultural values. Values such as white supremacy as the infrequent. This is a term that freak show scholars sometimes use, the infrequent, the turning of something or someone into freakishness, the infrequent of the living Chinese family. Now, as you may have already guessed from the way I've talked about these exhibits, freak show performers were often exploited by their managers or their promoters, and this is particularly true for people who were enslaved or people whom we would today recognize as developmentally disabled. And this is the crucial thing to recognize about freak shows, that many of the popular performers were either literally owned in the case of enslaved people or essentially owned in practice by their managers, in the sense that their managers had such total control often over their display. This was not the case for all performers. Some freak show performers, in fact, especially men who had physical disabilities, spoke openly about the fact that working in a freak show was one of their only ways to make a living in an economy that was still in the late 19th and early 20th centuries overwhelmingly dominated by physical labor, whether that was labor on a farm or labor in a factory. We'll talk at the end today about the decline of the freak show, and when the freak show did decline, it was no longer legally or socially acceptable. Many of the strongest opponents to actual laws that outlawed freak shows were performers themselves, performers who said, as I just mentioned, this is how I make my living. There were also some very rare cases in which freak show performers became financially successful or even wealthy thanks to this work. For example, there are 2 pairs of conjoined twins, Chang and Ang Bunker on the left and Millie and Christine McCoy on the right. Millie Christine I mentioned earlier. This is the two-headed nightingale. Both of these pairs of conjoined twins, by some sort of historical coincidence, were able to buy huge plots of land for their families, both in North Carolina, thanks to the money that they made working as freak show performers. Millie and Christine, in fact, were actually born enslaved in the 1850s. But after the Civil War ended, they actually bought back the farm where they and their family had been enslaved and gave that farm to their parents as a gift of land ownership. To be clear, these are not typical cases. Chang and Ang and Millie Christine are very unusual, but there are these few examples of performers who consented to their own display and perhaps even gained wealth out of it. In sum, from what I've just described here, freak shows included a wide array of physical sites and a wide array of performers. As you've already seen in the images I've shown you, it is clear and obvious that most freak show performers had some kind of visible feature, some kind of visible difference that an onlooker would notice right away. But it is also true that freak show performers were created by their managers and promoters through the use of popular visual and print media. What I mean by this is that what a particular freak show performer meant to an onlooker was deliberately crafted and often embellished through photographs, flyers, banners, pamphlets, and advertisements. And this is why I pushed back against that term born freaks earlier, because everyone was deliberately crafted. Everyone was made. Even someone like a conjoined twin was made in a sense. All performers on a freak show stage were doing exactly that. They were performing. One way that freak show managers crafted a performer's meaning was by making very specific and deliberate choices about the way the performers looked. Their clothing they wore, the way their hair was styled, the accessories they had, and the pose they put in which they configured their body. I'm just going to show you one example. The first bearded lady to perform in the United States was a woman who performed as Madame Clofulia, and she's shown here with her husband. You can see at the bottom, Madame Clofulia and husband. In about 1854, many bearded ladies were depicted with their husbands or their children in an effort to visually juxtapose the sort of normalcy of heterosexual marriage in the 19th century with the unusual, extraordinary beard that the woman wore. In addition to visual images like this, freak show managers crafted performers' meaning through the written word. For example, some managers published biographies or autobiographies of their freak show performers, which would be either sold for a few cents at the performance or could be purchased by people who didn't elsewhere in the country. And this was a way that information and images of freak show performers circulated even beyond the stages and those performances, that you could take home with you, or you could buy from afar a document that would tell a similar story. And in these biographies or purported autobiographies, they provided specific context and background that the manager wanted to get a certain reaction from the crowd. And perhaps unsurprisingly, these biographies were often fabricated or at the very least embellished to tell a particular kind of story. Managers also created promotional flyers like these seen here that used hyperbolic language to promote the performer as absolutely extraordinary. The woman on the left, for example, is not just some woman with a beard. She is, quote, the greatest curiosity of this age. And the woman on the right is said to be 161 years old. We're going to come back to her in a moment. She's not just a natural curiosity because of her advanced age. She is also, as it says at the top, a national curiosity, a figure of uniquely American patriotic interest, as her promoter claims. Her promoter was P.T. Barnum, so we're going to talk about her and Barnum more in a minute. What these images demonstrate is that the particular curiosity and meaning of a freak show performer was not necessarily self-evident. It was carefully constructed and precisely conveyed to the public by managers. There was no manager who was better at this game than the most successful and famous showman himself, P.T. Barnum. I want to tell you just briefly about Barnum's background, how he came to be the most famous and successful showman, and the person who really established a lot of the norms of this form of entertainment. Phineas Taylor Barnum was born in 1810 in Western Connecticut and grew up working on his family farm, like most people did in the early 19th century. He held a variety of jobs in his teenage years, including working at a country store, running a lottery, and publishing a newspaper. But he didn't have a lot of success in Connecticut. And so in his late teens, early 20s, he packed up his family and, like so many Americans in this moment, moved to New York City, which had recently become the nation's largest city. In New York City, Barnum, just within the first year, found his first big exhibit that would kickstart his career as a showman. And that is the woman you saw a moment ago, Joice Heth. Joice Heth is seen in this image from Barnum's autobiography. She's sitting right here wearing a headscarf. Joice Heth was an elderly Black enslaved woman who had already been displayed to the public as the 161-year-old former nurse to George Washington before Barnum became her proprietor in 1835. But her previous owners had not had very much success in exhibiting her, so they sold Heth to Barnum. And the particulars of her ownership, I use the word enslaved, I use the word sold, it's a little bit fuzzy. Joice Heth lived in the North in 1830. In 1835, slavery was no longer legal in northern states, but she was essentially, effectively, for all intents and purposes, owned enslaved, as would Black woman in the South at this time. So Barnum's a little bit slippery about the way that he describes this, but I think it's appropriate for us to think of her as being enslaved. Barnum promoted Joice Heth to the public by focusing on her advanced age, as well as her ancient body, her often described decrepit body is the language Barnum would use, as well as her wistful memories of her dear little George. Through these techniques, Barnum turned Heth into an absolute sensation. In her exhibition, Barnum developed some of the tools and tricks that he and other showmen would employ through the rest of the century to promote similar human curiosities. Barnum printed advertisements for Heth's exhibition in cheap daily newspapers, and he also took advantage of the public's fascination with authenticity and fakes. When the number of people who came to see Heth began to dwindle in number, a notice all of a sudden appeared in a local newspaper claiming that Heth was not actually a woman, but an automaton, a robot made from rubber and springs. Of course, this accusation of fraud only increased the number of people who came to see Heth, people who wanted to figure out for themselves if she was real or if she was just a fake. And it was Barnum himself who was almost certainly responsible for planting this false accusation of fraud. Barnum would continue to play with this idea of authenticity and fraud even after Heth died, less than a year after Barnum became her manager. When Heth died, Barnum arranged for a public autopsy of her body, in which he promoted the autopsy, which would be paid and was held in a kind of operating theater, so audience members could watch as a white surgeon cut open Heth's body to determine her true age. Of course, her true age was not 165. It was more like something in her mid-80s. But once again, even in death, Barnum played on the public's curiosity about whether something was true or false. Now, Barnum's modern heir, I would say, is the chain of Ripley's Believe It or Not museums across the United States. I don't know if any of you have been to one of them. I certainly have. There's actually one local to us here in the Bay on Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco. And this billboard gives you a sense of some of the contents of the Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum, which might remind you of some of the kinds of bodies that I've been talking about so far today. But it's not just the contents of these museums that demonstrate continuity from the Barnum era. But the name Ripley's Believe It or Not is also really key here, because that name conveys exactly what people who saw Joice Heth were doing. They were believing her to be true or not, but deciding for themselves. And this kind of democratic decide for yourself quality was a crucial part of what audiences were doing when they viewed the curiosities that Barnum displayed. And Barnum really took advantage of this curiosity when he displayed his human oddities. Barnum's success in displaying Joice Heth in the final year of her life paved the way for his new career as a showman and as a peddler of oddities. But Heth represented this older model of displaying unusual human bodies that I described earlier, in which one person would be displayed to relatively small audiences. Barnum took Joice Heth to a few different sites in a few different cities. But in 1842, Barnum transitioned to this new model of the consolidated freak show when he opened up the American Museum, a building that was located on Broadway in New York City, today just a few blocks away from where the World Trade Center once stood. The first thing to know about the American Museum is that it is probably unlike any museum you have ever visited, or I've ever visited. And unlike anything we'd probably imagine that would fall within the confines of this word museum. If you picture a museum in your mind, a museum you've visited, an art museum, a natural history museum, the American Museum basically combines the functions of what we today recognize as a bunch of different kinds of institutions. It is at once a natural history museum, a zoo, a circus, an art gallery, a lecture hall, and a theater. A theater that not only staged lectures and freak show performances, but also popular plays. The American Museum, in its many stories, displayed a massive array of objects, people, and performances. The American Museum thrived from the 1840s until 1868, hosting approximately 41 million visitors. And as a point of reference, the entire population of the United States in 1860 was 31 million. So 41 million people over about a 25-year period visited the American Museum, making it the most highly visited entertainment venue in the middle of the 19th century United States. The American Museum was not just extremely popular, it was also understood to be wholesome, middle-class, family-friendly entertainment that also was accessible to the working class and approved by the elites. It was open all day, Monday through Saturday, sometimes as long as 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. And that was so that working people could visit the museum after they finished their work shifts. Admission to the museum was just 25 cents. That's equivalent to about $8 today. So its cost is accessible to both middle and upper class families, but also within reach for working class families. And for this reason, the museum attracted a huge body of both New Yorkers and out-of-town visitors. The American Museum remained enormously popular until 1865, when a huge fire destroyed much of the building. Barnum moved to a new location, but was struck by a second fire just 3 years later, in which point he left the museum business altogether. And this was not sketchy. Fires are a massive problem in the 19th century in 19th century cities. So the fact that 2 museums of Barnum's burned down shouldn't make us suspect foul play, as The Greatest Showman leads us to believe. Barnum left the museum business in 1868, and he ultimately lent his name to the circus for which he became so familiar. He had other pursuits. He wrote 2 autobiographies. He even ran for political office, briefly serving as the mayor of Bridgeport, Connecticut in the 1870s. But really it was the American Museum that was his true passion and his major claim to fame. So far today, I've described when and how freak shows began in the United States and how P.T. Barnum became the king of American showmen, reigning over this enormously popular form of entertainment. What I really want to stress is that freak shows weren't just popular inside of a museum, a theater, or a circus tent. They quickly became a truly widespread cultural phenomenon that had resonance outside of exhibition spaces. They became a culturally salient point of reference for many American people. The kind of thing, you might even liken it to a meme in such that something that was immediately visibly recognizable to a contemporary viewer. I want to show you 2 examples briefly that illustrate this. The first is these 2 images. On the left, we have a photograph of a freak show performer who's known as Crow. That's the little girl being held in the man's arms. This is a photograph from about 1882. And on the right, I'm showing you a zoomed in crop of the front cover of this really popular San Francisco magazine called the San Francisco Wasp from just a year later, 1883. And the image you're seeing on the right is a satirical image. It was a satirical newspaper similar to The Onion, for example. And the image is a critique of a local political scandal that was rocking San Francisco in 1883. But what we can see immediately is this visual language that the image is evoking. It is quite almost to a detail, making the viewer think about this photograph of Crow. And this image on the right only makes sense to the viewer if the viewer is very familiar with the freak show as an institution. I'm going to show you one more image. This one comes from 1911. This is a cartoon published in Life magazine. Essentially, this is a critique of women's rights movement, of the effort to gain the right to vote, specifically for women. It does this by evoking, again, the freak show. This person right here is labeled the bearded lady. She is leaning forward to talk to this woman here who is labeled suffragette. The suffragette is saying, "How did you manage it?" The meaning here is that the suffragette, it's a critique of suffrage because of the suffrage movement. The suffragette is in this critique trying to turn herself into a man, and she's asking the bearded lady, "How did you manage? How did you manage to grow a beard?" Again, a critique of a political movement that uses the language of the freak show. Freak shows in this way, we can see, were not merely popular entertainment. Freak shows served as a form of education for their audiences and provided audience members with a way to learn about the larger human world. Certainly when they appeared in settings like this, but also even on the stages themselves. The education that people received, though, was not neutral. By displaying people with unusual bodies and unusual cultural backgrounds, again, relative to the American audience members, freak shows became an institution that explained and justified, reflected and reinforced the power hierarchies that structured their world. Hierarchies of nationality, hierarchies of bodily ability and disability, hierarchies of gender, and most of all, hierarchies of race. We can already see an example of hierarchies of gender operational in this life cartoon. But race, as we'll explore in a minute, was truly the most commonly referenced hierarchy, or the most commonly discussed and justified and implicated hierarchy in these displays. By collectively bearing witness to these unusual bodies on a freak show stage, audience members secured their own feeling of normalcy. Freak shows became essentially a mass public ritual that forged a sense of power and solidarity among onlookers. A sense of power and solidarity in direct contrast with the bodies that they watched on the stage. Even the physical space of a freak show, in which the performers were up high on a stage, physically separated from the audience, even the physical space created a sense of hierarchy and distance between performer and viewer. And the hierarchy that I would argue the freak show reinforced more than any other is, as I've already suggested, race. The role of race at the freak show in the United States began with the audience. As I described earlier, freak show audiences were diverse in terms of class, wealth, and occupation, as well as men and women and children, so age and gender as well. But they were largely not diverse in terms of race. Black people were not in the real or imagined audience for a freak show. We can see one piece of evidence of this limitation in this advertisement from the New York Tribune for Barnum's American Museum. The second paragraph, which I've pointed that little red arrow towards, says this: notice two persons of color, and this is referring directly to Black people. In order to afford respectable colored persons an opportunity to witness the extraordinary attractions at present exhibited at the museum, the manager has determined to admit this class of people on Thursday morning next, March 1st, from 8 a.m. till 1 p.m. Special performances in the lecture room at 11 a.m. What this says basically is colored persons in New York City during one 5-hour window on a Thursday morning. The implication being that, aside from the special window, they were prohibited from entering the museum. Thus, for the freak show's overwhelmingly white audience, the non-white bodies they watched on stage reassured them of their claims to citizenship and to racial superiority. Freak shows allow the audience to identify with and embrace a common white identity. And this was an important factor to consider when thinking about the historical context in which freak shows occurred. Millions of European immigrants arrived in American cities after the 1850s and especially after the 1890s. And because freak shows didn't require any kind of linguistic capacity, audience member didn't need to understand performance, for example. What this meant was that performances allowed immigrants to experience a sense of solidarity with the American-born members of the crowd, to essentially participate, even if it's for a brief moment, in whiteness. Some scholars have argued, and I actually agree with this argument, that the freak show as a physical place demonstrates continuity with two important sites of racial violence: the slave market and a lynching. Like these two sites of white on Black violence, freak shows too saw white solidarity forged through the inspection, evaluation, and even the destruction of the Black body. Similar to lynchings, freak shows also used a physical distance and a power imbalance to cement cultural and racial hierarchy. And especially after the abolition of slavery in 1865 at the end of the Civil War, because freak shows continued for decades after, freak shows could also function as a site and as an institution that could explain and justify a racial hierarchy, the existing racial hierarchy in the United States. They could be a site where race could be discussed and shaped among ordinary people. Some freak shows exhibited Black, Indigenous, and other people of color as exoticized displays. In that way, they're belonging on a freak show stage merely as a byproduct of their lack of whiteness. And the Living Chinese Family is a perfect example of this. This is a way in which many freak show performances implicitly reinforced racial hierarchies, in which people of color were freakish and the audience was white. But there were other exhibits that more explicitly evoked racial hierarchy. And I want to just briefly, for the sake of time, tell you about one exhibit that did this. This exhibit was called the What Is It? This is one of Barnum's exhibits that began in February of 1860. And the exhibit was, the character of the What Is It was performed by a man from New Jersey named William Henry Johnson. He likely was someone who had microencephaly. We would today recognize as microencephalic. And the exhibit, as this image suggested that Johnson was not from New Jersey, but from Africa, from deepest, darkest Africa. It was in this way a nod to imperialism and to colonization in other parts of the world. And this phrase, what is it, the name of this character, referred to the question of whether this person, this figure, was a man or an animal, or perhaps a missing link between, in explicit reference to Darwin. Because Darwin's on the origin of species, which was, you're likely familiar with this text, a formative text, a hugely famous text in racial, in our understanding of evolution and of the connection between people and animals, was published in 1859, just 1 year before What Is It was first displayed on a freak show stage. And in this way, Barnum is very directly tapping into contemporary scientific debates to increase the appeal of this performer. You can see too, in the way that this image is constructed, you can see that Johnson is portrayed, that the What Is It character is portrayed as animalistic, as perhaps dangerous. You'll notice the open mouth and the teeth. You'll notice the stick that he's holding, the background, the clothing, the lack of shoes, which is supposed to signal a lack of civility or civilization. The full picture here is one of a character that is exotic, a character that is scary, and a character that is perhaps, if not fully animalistic, a missing link between human and animals. When in fact, this is a Black man from New Jersey. What's really curious about this display, and I think really rich for our analysis, is that this was not the only way that Barnum portrayed this character. Because in other promotional images, the What Is It character looked more like this. In this image is not so much about the performer himself. This is an image that is speaking directly to the audience. This image says, freak shows are family friendly and they're respectable. Because you'll see here this close physical proximity of members, not just any audience members, but women and children. And what that is directly to view this safe place to be. In a way, the reason I'm showing you these images is because we really stress that multiple images, multiple historic sources, complicate our understanding and our analysis of this. And for me, corroborate our analysis. It also speaks to the significance of context. What I mean by that is, if you find a random historical image on it, it's twits out of context. It really needs corroboration and especially contextual.
Uh-oh, I think we may have lost Sarah.
Hi. Lost you.
That's okay. Do you want to continue where you left off?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm almost.
That's okay. No problem at all. Go ahead. Go ahead, Sarah.
I wanted to briefly end today by just talking about the decline of the freak show as a popular, an organ of popular entertainment. I mentioned that the freak show was popular starting in about the 1840s through about the 1920s, but it was really in the 1910s when freak shows began to decline in popularity. And this is largely due to the way in which human physical difference became medicalized and pathologized. What I mean by that is freak show performers were no longer seen as eliciting entertainment or laughter, but instead more likely to elicit sympathy. The unusual human bodies were classified and pathologized. Someone previously called a pinhead might now be identified as someone with microencephaly. In this way, then, unusual human bodies move from the purview of entertainment to the purview of medical science. As I mentioned at the beginning, some states actually passed laws in the early 20th century to ban the exhibition of people with mental or physical disabilities. For example, Florida in 1921 passed such a law at the state level. But as I mentioned, one thing that's very fascinating about these laws is that some of the biggest pushback actually came from the performers themselves. One final example I want to tell you that really crystallizes the way that freak shows had totally fallen out of popular approval by the 1930s is this film released in 1932 called Freaks. By a filmmaker named Todd Browning. This is the promotional poster right here. This film was about freak show performers, and it starred many actual freak show performers. People who had, in addition to being in this film, were actually had performed in sideshows and in museums. The film was so unpopular and provoked such a horrified reaction among audiences that it actually was pulled from theaters within, I think, the first week or the first month. You can find, for the sake of time, I'm not going to show a clip of the climactic scene from this film, but in all likelihood, you've actually seen references to it even in our contemporary culture. If you've ever heard someone say, one of us, they're referencing this film, Freaks. It comes from the climactic dinner party scene, which you actually can see on the poster here, when the freak show performers with unusual bodies try to share a drink with this woman here, who is a trapeze artist. And she yells at them. She's horrified. She's disgusted. She says, "Freaks, you're all freaks," and she rushes out of the room. So one of us is a chant you hear in popular culture to this day. Like, I've seen it in The Simpsons. I've seen it in Orange is the New Black. I've seen it elsewhere. It comes from this film. But the film's real, in addition to this weird cultural residue that still exists today, it really marks this complete change in social sanction for the freak show. To conclude briefly, I just want to mention that freak shows, I think, are something that I've really devoted a lot of my study to ever since I was an undergraduate, actually. And the reason is because they're not just what we might assume upon first inspection, some kind of mindless form of popular entertainment. But instead, as I hope I've shown you today, freak shows were so popular and had this sense of legitimacy, the sense of scientific knowledge even, that allowed them to serve as a forum for public education, essentially. Freak shows mattered. They really shaped the way and reinforced the way a lot of people saw the world, and especially the way people saw race. And I think at this particular moment when the public at large, and not just historians, are talking a lot about the legacies of slavery and segregation in the United States, and the way that these institutions are still, we can still feel the residue and the consequences of these institutions today, in this moment of, the explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement, of protests against police violence. I think it's really important for us to notice the way that in our past, it wasn't just law, policy, or politics that enforced racial difference. Even popular culture supported and undergirded and even taught people about white supremacy. So I'm going to end there. I apologize for going past my intended time, but I would love to take questions now.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really awesome presentation, Sarah. So we do have a couple questions that we can go through quickly. Anna would like to know, does Bogdan write about the cultural significance of the movie Freaks in his book that you mentioned earlier?
I think my former student, Anna. I hope so. Hello. Hi, Anna. That is a great question. I honestly can't recall if Bogdan talks about freaks in his book. I think so. I think it is in the book, but if this is my former student, Anna, I'll send you an email afterwards. Double check. I have the book at home.
Anna's last name starts with a B, if that helps.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, and we have another question from Katie. Was Heth's autopsy able to be viewed because she was sold, or was the lack of privacy in medical instances common? And were there any rules about this at the time?
A really good question. So public medical procedure is not unique to Heth's autopsy, but it was a function of her race and her effectively enslaved status that made it a socially sanctioned kind of event. A poor person, a working class person, a Black person could be in a social, propriety around the body, or a sense of both privacy and sort of, I can't think of the word I'm thinking of, a sense in which someone would, propriety around another person's body and their privacy and their genitalia and other parts of their body usually covered by clothing would be extended, say, to an elite white woman, but would not be extended to an enslaved Black woman. It's certainly the case that medical, and I think also what's different here is that public autopsies or public medical procedures might occur in an educational setting, like a medical school, but would be less likely to occur in a lecture hall in the way that Heth's autopsy did. So in that way, it is quite unusual.
Okay, another question we have from Julia. Did freak shows often coexist with minstrel shows in similar spaces?
That's a good question. Hello, Julia. So minstrel shows, for folks who aren't familiar, or maybe we are familiar now that we're talking a lot about our American history, are performances in which white people put on facial makeup and clothing and pretended or performed as if they were Black in a caricaturized, hyperbolized version of Black culture. Let's see, there are absolutely co-occurrences in terms of space. So you might see on a theatrical stage, one night you could see a freak show, and then perhaps a week later you might see a minstrel performance. So in terms of the physical spaces, theatrical stages, yes, absolutely. And minstrelsy is another really good example of a form of popular culture that taught white people about race, and that taught white people about racial hierarchy in particular.
Okay, Joy has a question as well. When was the last freak show officially, and where?
Okay, so what's really fascinating about freak shows is they actually do still continue to this day, but in a different kind of format. There's a documentary, for example, about a woman who performs in Coney Island as a bearded lady to this day, or at least as of maybe 10 years ago. So there are these lingering examples of freak show performances. Through the middle of the 20th century, they still occur in places like Coney Island, but they get this different kind of reputation. They are seedy, they are slimy, they are sketchy. They're like not something you take a kid to, not something a middle-class person would attend. Today in the 21st century, there are some examples of people who kind of reclaimed an identity as a freak show performer. What's really different about people who are sort of modern freak show performers is that they're doing so with their own volition and their own agency and consent. That is a major distinction from many, many performers that performed in the sort of heyday of the freak show. There's also scholars who have written about freak shows of the 19th century and drawn continuity between those performances and things like reality television shows that document, there's one, I think it's called My 600-Pound Life, or reality programs that focus on people with unusual bodies, and argue that there's some continuities in what audiences are doing when they watch these performances, those performances and these reality shows. But I would argue that the big difference is the screen that mediates those viewings, that a freak show is live entertainment. And it is far, far less common today to have a live freak show. They do exist, as I said, in small numbers and in particular places. Coney Island has retained this particular function. But the other ways in which the rest of us who don't physically attend an in-person freak show might encounter an unusual body in an entertainment context is always mediated through a screen, whether it's a TV show, a movie, or online. And I think that makes a big difference, that mediation of the screen, because there's not that visual confrontation of making eye contact with the person you're watching.
That's really fascinating. I think that's all we have time for today. So before we go, thank you, Sarah, so much for that awesome presentation. I really enjoyed it. I have my own list of questions that I'll probably email you. And I can't wait to hear more about your book. I know a lot of people that visit our museum are really interested in the concept of hair work and hair in general. So I'm sure we'll have a lot of interest once it's published. And for all of our attendees tonight, Sarah has graciously given us permission, to record tonight's presentation. So in the next few days, you'll receive a link about how to access the recording on our YouTube channel. Really quick, next week we also have another virtual history happy hour with Dan Real, who is the co-founder of Catalog It, who will be joining us for a webinar about preserving your family's history and tips on how you can become a proper family historian. So if you'd like to register for that, the address to do so is www.cshouse.org/events, and I'll type that into the chat if anyone wants to stick around and do that. And finally, an immense thank you for all of you for coming to support our work tonight. We do rely on the support of our community to make all of our programs, exhibits, and preservation work happen. So if you're able, please consider donating to the Camron-Stanford House, or perhaps even signing up for a membership to show your support. And again, information can be found online, cshouse.org. So thank you all so much for being here with us tonight, and have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next time. And thank you again, Sarah.
Oh, absolutely. I put my email address in the chat. If I didn't get a chance to answer your question, I'm sorry again, I went over my planned time, but please don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions. I'd be more than happy to talk later over email.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sarah, and we'll see you soon. Okay, bye. Thank you, everyone.